online meetup. In today's meetup, we will learn about Docker Compose version 2, about its new enhancement and the new format of the Docker Compose file and so on. So what we will see today, we'll start with a very basic introduction to Docker Compose. It will be followed by a simple multi-container application that we will build and run using Docker Compose. For this phase, we will use Docker Compose version 1. Then we will get a very brief introduction to Docker Compose version 2. We'll go back, we'll convert the file that we use in the Docker version 1 to Docker version 2, Docker Compose version 2. And then we'll talk about some additional enhancement of Docker Compose version 2, such as the networks and the volume. And we'll leave some time for question and answer in the end. Okay, so Docker Compose. Docker Compose is basically a tool that allows us to define a multi-containers application, a composition, and then build it and run it. Run it on our local host, run it on a remote host, run it on top of multiple hosts using Docker Swarm, and so on. We will cover Docker Swarm in one of the future meetups. You can get a complete documentation of Docker Compose on docs.docker.com/compose. So as we said, the most convenient way to kind of learn about Docker Compose is to try it out. We will use the Let's Chat app that we've used in the previous meetups. And this app is actually, it's a multi-container app. There are two containers that will run as part of this application. One of them will be out of an image that Docker Compose will create with our Node.js code, and another container will be out of a standard Mongo image. So we'll use this Docker Compose file here that we will write together, and it will have two components. One component will be the web, and Docker Compose will build the Docker image for that service, and the other component will be Mongo, and in that case Docker Compose will pull an image, pull a Mongo image from the Docker registry or from the cache. Okay, so let's start doing that. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go and clone the repo of the Node.js from GitHub. So I'm going to go to GitHub. github.com/containers101/demo chat. So this is our application. Let's copy the URL and let's go to the console and do git clone with this URL, and now we're getting the repo. Okay, so we have the repo here. Let's do this. We have the repo. Now let's go into the directory of the repo and we'll see what we have. In fact, we can see that we have a Docker file already. This Docker file will tell the daemon, the Docker daemon, how to build a Docker image for this code. Now let's create a Docker Compose file that will both build a Docker image for the Node.js service, as well as pull a Docker image for Mongo, and then spin up the containers of the Node.js and the Mongo and connect them together. So let's start by using vi, and then the default name for Docker Compose file will be Docker Compose YAML. And now let's start writing the first service, call it web. We'll ask the Docker Compose to build it, and the context will be the current directory. We'll also specify the ports. So this will run in port 5000. That will be exposed on the 5000 port of the host. We'll also specify the links. So we'll write links, and then we will want this container to be linked to the Mongo container. So we'll write Mongo. Now we want it to be referred as Mongo, so we can write it this way, but since we're using the very same name, we can basically just leave it like that. Now the next component here is Mongo, and in that case we're not building the image, or we're pulling the image. So write image and Mongo. That's basically it. I'm going to go in more details over this file. Let's just start running the docker compose build command. And now as we run it, we can see that for the Mongo component, docker compose is actually using an image. What it will do, it will start building an image for the web component. As it does so, let's take a closer look at the docker compose file. So let's cut docker compose and let's look at it. So what docker compose is now doing is start building an image for this first component here, for the first service, which is web. It will use the current context, so in the current in the docker file image, the docker file that we have in the current directory, and the name of the image that a docker compose will create will be the name of the directory in which it's running, underscore the name of the service. So in that case, we are actually now running within the demo chat folder. So the name of the image will be demo chat underscore web. So that's the image that it will create. Then it will also establish, when we run this docker compose, it will establish a link between web and Mongo, and the web container will be able to reach out to the Mongo by simply calling its name Mongo. Now, we can see one more thing about the Docker Compose version 1. Each service can either have a build command or an image command. It cannot have these two in conjunction. In Docker Compose version 2, in fact, we can have build and image in the very same service. And what will happen is that when we're using build and image together in the same service, Docker Compose will build an image, but the name that it will give that image will be the name that will specify under image. It will not use the default name, as we just say, which is the name of the folder, underscore the name of the service. Okay, let's go back here and see that the process is actually ended. So if we run docker images, we can see that Docker Compose have just created an image, as we said, with a default name demo chat underscore web. Let's run it. Docker Compose up. So this will now run our application. If you want to see this application running, let's find out which IP we can use to reach out our local host. To do that, we'll run docker machine IP, and the default host is the one that I'm using now, and this is the IP. Let's go back to the browser. Let's put in here this IP with port 5000, and we can see our application running. Again, that was a very brief and fast intro to Docker Compose version 1. Let me stop our composition. So I'll come back here, I'll do Control C, just make sure everything stop, and then let's remove the old container. I usually do that, it keeps everything clean. So now we stop the composition, and let's go back and start learning about Docker Compose version 2. So I'll go back to the presentation, and now we can see that the format of the Docker Compose version 2 file is slightly different. We can have 3 sections. In fact, we need to have at least the services section. The networks and volumes are optional. The file has to start with version and to indicate to Docker Compose that this is following the version 2 specification. So we'll start by specifying version 2, and then we can list services, and then optionally we can add networks and volume. In this meetup, we'll talk on both, on each one of the sections here. So let's look at how we can actually convert the Docker Compose version 1 that we did into version 2. So in fact, we can only use the services section for that, and we will put these 2 components under services. Now, if you take if you take a closer look, you can see that in fact we can play a little bit more with the services now in version 2, as it provides additional enhancement. So as we said earlier, we can give the web service both the build command and image, and in that case the Docker Compose will override the default name and will name the image based on everything that we specify under image. We can also pass an object to the build. So we can specify a different context, and we can specify a different default Docker file if we don't want to use the default Docker file, which is named Docker file. Okay, let's do that. Let's go back and start modifying the Docker Compose version 1 that we wrote and convert it into version 2. So I'll go back to the console, and then let's do vi Docker Compose, and let's start by indicating it's version 2. And now that we have section services, and let's start bring everything forward. Okay, basically now this should work, but let's play a little bit more with it and start using some of the enhancement we can use in Docker Compose version 2. So right after the build, let's add image, and we can tell the Docker Compose to name it differently. We can tell to name it just web. We can also remove the links here, and I will explain in a second why we can remove it. But let's start running the Docker build in the same time, because that will take some time for the image to be built. So do Docker Compose build. Okay, so we had a spelling error. Let's see what it is. So probably we misspell the version. Let's go back. Version. Oh, services is missing. Okay. So now let's go try it again. Good. So now it's work and it started building the Docker image. Now let's take again a closer look at what we did. Let's do cat Docker. And in fact, we can see that this is version 2. We start listing the services under the services section. There is one for web, there is one for Mongo. Now you also probably noticed that I took off the links. And to elaborate a little bit about that, what happens is that when Docker Compose spin up this composition, unless specified differently, it will create a default network. And under this default network, the web component can reach out to the Mongo by simply calling its name, and vice versa. The Mongo can reach out the web by simply calling its name. So there is no need, if we just want these containers to be able to reach out to each other using its name, we don't necessarily need to specify that. That's what will happen by default. We will dive a little bit deeper into networks when we talk about networks in Docker Compose version 2. But for now, let's go back, and this process ended. Let's start running our converted Docker Compose file. So we do that Docker Compose up, and it will spin up our application again. So we can go back to the browser, we can do a refresh, and we can see that our application is running again. Okay, so everything worked. Let's stop the composition and let's move next. So we'll do Docker Compose stop. It stopped both of these containers. Let's remove the containers. Okay, everything is clean. Let's go back to the presentation. So now let's take a closer look at networks and what we can do there. Basically, this section networks allows us to create or declare additional networks, and then later on we can specify for each one of the services to which network it will be connected. So in this example, we simply created a new network called internal. We're using the bridge, which means this will run on the local host that the composition will be running. We can actually also use the driver overlay, and that will create a network that can run across multiple hosts using Swarm. And then, as we can see here, for each one of the services, we specify to which network it will be connected. So in this example, what we did, we created 3 services. We connected service 1 to both the internal networks and the default network, service 2 just to the internal network, and service 3 just to the default network. So what will happen is that after we'll spin up this composition, service 1, since it's connected to both internal and default, it will be able to reach out to both service 2 and service 3. However, service 2, it connected only to the internal network. So it will be able to reach out only to service 1, but not to service 2. Okay, let's see that in action. So let's go back to the console. I've actually created this Docker Compose file up front. So if we move into the networking folder and I'll do cat Docker Compose, we can see that same here. We created 3 services, service 1, service 2, service 3. We created a network. Service 1 will be connected into default and internal, service 2 only internal, service 3 only default. Now, to make it simple, I basically, for all of these services, we're just running the latest Ubuntu image, and the command that we're running will be sleep. So we'll just spin it up and they will sleep, but we will be able to run bash on each one of them and test the connectivity. So let's do that. Let's do docker compose app. Now this will spin up these 3 services and we'll connect them to the network as specified in the Docker Compose file. Let's run docker ps, and we can actually see that there are 3 containers now running. Let's run docker exec, which allows us to run a program, run bash or any other command on a running container. So we do docker exec -it to capture the standard input and output, and then we will run it on the service 1 container. So now we are actually in the service 1 container, and we'll try to do ping for service 2. You can actually see that we're getting a reply, which means our service 1 can connect to service 2 by simply using its name, service 2. Let's try if it can connect to service 3. In a very same way, we can see that service 1 can connect to both service 2 and service 3 by simply using the service name. Okay, now let's step out of this container. And now let's connect into service 2. So we'll do docker exec again, but I'm going to change and log into service 2. Now we're in service 2. If we'll try to connect from service 2 to service 1, we can see that we get a reply because they're both sharing the internal network. However, if I'm going to do ping to service 3, we can actually see that service 2 doesn't know service 3 and cannot connect to it. And that's because service 3 is running on just the default network, and service 2 is connected just to the new network we named internal. So that was a very basic kind of demonstration of how we can use networks within Docker Compose. Let's go back to the presentation and do look into volumes, but before that, let me stop the composition. Okay, also run docker compose stop just to make sure everything stop, and docker compose rm to remove these containers. Okay, now let's go back to the presentation again. and take a look at volumes. So we can actually define volumes also in Docker Compose version 1, but Docker Compose version 2 allows us to more conveniently declare volumes and mount them to the different services. So in this case, we've actually created a new volume. We call it data, and then for each one of these services here, we see that we mounted this volume data to a local directory named data on the service. Okay, so let's see that in action. Let's go back to the console. And in fact, in the very same case here, I have created up front a Docker Compose file for it. So let's go into volumes and let's take a look at this Docker Compose file. We can see that there are two services here. We've created a new volume named data, and then we mounted this volume into local directory in each one of the services. In this case, again, we have just used a very simple image of the latest of Ubuntu, and we run sleep in that image. Okay, let's do Docker Compose up, and actually we have these containers running. We can run Docker PS. We can see these two containers. Let's do Docker exec again, -it, and let's connect to this service, and we run bash on it. If we run ls, we can see that we have data here. If we do ls data, there is nothing in this folder. Now let's connect also to service 2. So I'll do Docker PS, and now here we'll do Docker exec -it, and in this time we're connecting into service 2, and we run bash, and service 2 also have data, and if we go into data, we can see that it has nothing in it. We can run touch, so let's just create a file, a sample file, touch test. So we can see that we created a file named test, and if we'll go back here and we'll do ls again, ls data, we can see that the file is shared because the volume is shared between these containers. So this was again a very simple way that Docker Compose version 2 allows us to declare or create volumes and then mount them to the individual services. So just a little bit of a recap to what we have seen today. We first run this multi-container application using Docker Compose version 1, and then we'll learn about Docker Compose version 2. We'll learn that there are 3 sections there: services, networks, and volumes. The network and volumes, again, they're optional. Services needs to be there. It has to start with version 2 to indicate to Docker Compose that this file is following the version 2 specification. Then we've converted what we did in Docker Compose version 1 into Docker Compose version 2. We did a very basic network example that shows us how we can create a network, and we can decide for each one of these containers to which network it will be connected. And now we can do similarly on volumes.